Robert Bobby Mitchell had spent 72 years learning that dignity wasn't something you could buy, sell, or negotiate away. He'd built Mitchell Supply Chain Solutions from nothing, starting with a single rented truck in Newark and growing it into a nationwide empire worth hundreds of millions. But on this crisp October afternoon at the exclusive Riverside Country Club in Connecticut, all of that success felt fragile as tissue paper. His 89-year-old mother, Margaret Maggie Mitchell, was about to walk through those imposing oak doors to witness him sign the biggest deal of his career, a $1.2 billion merger with Whitmore Industries that would secure his family's legacy for generations. What Bobby didn't know was that the next 30 minutes would force him to choose between everything he'd built and everything he believed in. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns as Maggie stepped out of her modest Honda Civic, smoothing down her finest navy dress, the one she'd worn to her husband's funeral 15 years earlier. Her pearl earrings, a wedding gift from 1958, caught the light as she adjusted her white church hat with trembling fingers. She'd worked 3 jobs to put Bobby through college, scrubbing floors at the university library until her knees ached, taking in laundry for professors' wives, and cleaning houses in the wealthy neighborhoods where she now stood as an honored guest. The irony wasn't lost on her, but pride swelled in her chest as she walked toward the club's entrance, her worn leather purse clutched tightly in both hands. Inside the mahogany-paneled dining room, Bobby raised his champagne flute toward the assembled crowd of lawyers, executives, and Whitmore family members. Victoria Whitmore, 68 and draped in inherited confidence, sat at the head table with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never worked a day for anything she owned. Her son Bradley fidgeted with his Rolex, while her eldest, Clinton, reviewed the final contract pages with the methodical precision of old money protecting itself. The merger documents lay spread across the antique table like a roadmap to Bobby's future. Every clause negotiated, every detail scrutinized, every dollar accounted for. All that remained was his signature. But as Bobby began his toast, his eyes drifted toward the entrance, searching for the woman who'd sacrificed everything so he could stand in this room. What he saw through the tall windows made his blood freeze. A uniformed staff member had stepped directly into his mother's path, blocking her way with the casual authority of someone enforcing unwritten rules. Bobby watched his mother's face, the same expression she'd worn when landlords threatened eviction, when bill collectors called during dinner, when the world tried to make her feel small. Dignity under pressure, grace in the face of humiliation. Then Victoria's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade through silk, carrying across the terrace with crystalline clarity. "Well, I suppose they let anyone in these days. Are we really allowing the cleaning staff to dine with us now?" The words hung in the Connecticut air like smoke from a house fire. Impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Several guests chuckled nervously, unsure whether they'd witnessed a joke or a judgment. Bradley's face flushed red as he mumbled something about misunderstandings, but Bobby had stopped listening. The champagne flute trembled in his weathered hand as memories crashed over him like a tide. Watching his mother count food stamps at the grocery store, seeing her iron his school shirts at midnight after her second shift, remembering how she'd held her head high when other parents whispered about the scholarship kid whose mother cleaned their houses. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment she'd chosen his future over her comfort crystallized into this single, devastating instant. The merger document suddenly felt like chains. The champagne tasted like ash, and the room full of millionaires looked like exactly what it was, a place where his mother would never truly belong, no matter how much money he made. Bobby set down his glass with the deliberate calm of a man who just discovered what he was really made of. The room continued its polite chatter, oblivious to the earthquake happening inside him. In 30 seconds, he would walk outside to his mother. In 5 minutes, he would make a decision that would echo through boardrooms and headlines from coast to coast. But right now, in this moment suspended between his past and his future, Bobby Mitchell understood something his 72 years had been teaching him all along. Some prices are simply too high to pay, even for everything you've ever wanted. The October air carried the crisp promise of New England autumn, as Maggie Mitchell stepped carefully from her Honda Civic onto the pristine cobblestone driveway of Riverside Country Club. At 89, her movements were deliberate but dignified. Each step measured with the same careful precision she'd used to navigate 60 years of cleaning other people's homes. Her navy dress, pressed to perfection that morning, caught the afternoon light filtering through the ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of Connecticut's elite conducting their most important business within these hallowed walls. She paused for a moment, adjusting the pearl earrings that had been her wedding gift in 1958, when she and Robert had promised each other a lifetime of shared dreams on a postal worker's salary. Those same pearls had adorned her ears at Robert's funeral 15 years ago, and now they seemed to catch the sunlight like tiny beacons of the dignity she'd maintained through decades of struggle. Her white church hat, the one with the ribbon that matched her sensible pumps, sat perfectly atop silver hair that she'd styled herself that morning, using the same careful attention to detail that had made her the most requested housekeeper in 3 New Jersey counties. The country club loomed before her like a monument to old money and older traditions. Built in 1923, its Georgian architecture spoke of an America where bloodlines mattered more than bank accounts, where the right last name opened doors that talent alone never could. The limestone facade gleamed in the afternoon sun, each window reflecting the manicured grounds that stretched toward Long Island Sound. Maggie had cleaned houses like this for 40 years, but she'd never entered one as an invited guest, never walked through the front door with her head held high as the mother of the man everyone inside was waiting to meet. As she approached the imposing oak doors, each one easily 12 feet tall and carved with intricate patterns that probably cost more than most people's cars, Maggie felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Inside those doors, her Bobby was about to sign papers that would change their family's trajectory forever. The merger with Whitmore Industries represented more than just business. It was validation that a boy from Newark's Central Ward could build something lasting, something that mattered in rooms where his mother had once scrubbed floors on her hands and knees. But before she could reach for the brass handle polished to mirror brightness, a figure in a crisp navy uniform materialized in her path. The woman, perhaps 45, with the kind of practiced authority that comes from years of gatekeeping, positioned herself squarely between Maggie and the entrance. Her badge read, "Guest Services," but her expression suggested something far less welcoming. "Excuse me," the uniformed woman said, her voice carrying the particular brand of politeness that barely concealed disdain. "Deliveries and staff use the service entrance around back. You'll find it on the left side of the building past the kitchen loading dock." Maggie blinked slowly, the words hitting her like a physical blow, even though she'd heard variations of them countless times before. In 1962, when she'd tried to attend a parent-teacher conference at Bobby's elementary school. In 1978, when she'd arrived early to pick him up from a birthday party in Short Hills. In 1985, when she'd attended his college graduation and been directed to the family seating section by an usher who assumed she was someone's domestic help. Each time, the assumption cut a little deeper, but she'd learned to carry the pain quietly, to protect her children from the weight of a world that seemed determined to diminish her. "I'm here for lunch," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "With my son, Robert Mitchell. He's meeting with the Whitmore family today." The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps? Or the kind of cognitive dissonance that occurs when reality doesn't match expectations. She glanced down at her clipboard, then back at Maggie, as if trying to reconcile the elderly black woman in the church dress with the guest list she'd memorized. "Yes, well," the woman continued, her tone suggesting she was doing Maggie a favor by explaining the obvious. "If you're with the catering staff or here to assist with the event setup, policy requires all service personnel to use the designated entrance. It's nothing personal, just club regulations." From across the terrace, where crystal glasses caught the afternoon light and conversations hummed with the comfortable confidence of inherited wealth, Victoria Whitmore observed the scene unfolding at the club's entrance. At 68, she embodied everything that old Connecticut money represented. The kind of woman who'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow felt entitled to judge those who had. Her pearls, easily worth more than most people's annual salaries, rested against a silk blouse that cost more than Maggie's monthly Social Security check. She'd been born into privilege, married into more privilege, and spent 7 decades believing that her comfort was the natural order of things. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she watched the exchange. Her champagne flute paused halfway to her lips. She'd built her identity on being able to read people, to categorize them instantly into their proper social strata. The elderly black woman at the entrance didn't fit her mental map of who belonged in spaces like this. In Victoria's world, people who looked like Maggie cleaned the silver, not sat at tables where it was displayed. "Well," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the terrace with the kind of projection that comes from decades of commanding attention at charity galas and board meetings. "I suppose they let anyone in these days." The words hung in the Connecticut air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Several nearby guests turned their heads, some with embarrassment, others with the kind of knowing smiles that suggested they'd been thinking the same thing. She took a sip of her champagne, seemingly oblivious to the impact of her words, and continued with the casual cruelty that privilege often mistakes for wit. "Are we really allowing the cleaning staff to dine with us now? I thought this was supposed to be an exclusive event." The comment rippled across the terrace like a stone thrown into still water. Bradley Whitmore, Victoria's youngest son, felt his face flush red as he mumbled something about misunderstandings, but his words were lost in the sudden tension that had descended over the gathering. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, while others seemed to lean in, as if witnessing a car accident they couldn't look away from. Inside the dining room, Bobby had been raising his champagne flute in preparation for a toast when the sound of his mother's voice drifted through the tall windows. Something in her tone, patient but strained, dignified but defensive, made him pause mid-gesture. He'd heard that particular combination before, usually when she was trying to explain to some store clerk or office receptionist that she belonged somewhere she was being told she didn't. His eyes found the windows that overlooked the entrance, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There was his mother, the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to put him through college, standing in front of the club's entrance while a uniformed staff member gestured toward the service entrance. But it was Victoria's voice, carrying across the terrace with aristocratic clarity, that turned his champagne to ash in his mouth. The merger documents lay spread across the mahogany table behind him. Months of negotiations, legal reviews, and strategic planning reduced to signatures on dotted lines. The Whitmore Industries logo appeared on every page, a symbol of the partnership that would catapult Mitchell Supply Chain Solutions into the upper echelons of American business. His legal team sat ready with their Mont Blanc pens, His CFO had already pulled up the wire transfer authorizations on his laptop, and the champagne had been poured to celebrate what everyone in the room assumed was a foregone conclusion. But as Victoria's words echoed in his ears, cleaning staff and letting anyone in these days, Bobby felt something fundamental shift inside him. The room full of millionaires suddenly looked different. The crystal glasses seemed to mock him, and the merger documents felt like chains rather than liberation. Every sacrifice his mother had made, every night she'd come home with aching feet and cleaning solution under her fingernails, every time she'd held her head high when the world tried to make her feel small. All of it crystallized into this single, devastating moment. He set down his champagne flute with the deliberate care of a man who just realized he was standing at a crossroads. The sound of crystal meeting mahogany seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. His colleagues noticed the change in his expression, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes went from warm to arctic in the space of a heartbeat. Thomas Mitchell, his younger brother and business partner, started to ask if everything was all right, but Bobby was already moving toward the door. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled calm that anyone who'd known him for more than 5 minutes would recognize as dangerous. The room watched him go, champagne glasses suspended in midair, conversations dying in mid-sentence as the man they'd all come to celebrate walked away from the table where his signature would have made him richer than he'd ever dreamed possible. Outside, Maggie stood with her purse clutched in both hands, her dignity intact despite the humiliation she'd just endured. She'd faced worse than this, much worse, and survived with her spirit unbroken. But as she saw her son approaching, she felt something crack inside her chest. Not for herself, but for him. She'd spent 70 years learning to absorb these moments, to let them roll off her back like water off a duck's feathers. But watching her son's face as he processed what had just happened, she realized that some wounds cut deeper when they're inflicted on the people we love most. Bobby reached his mother's side and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch conveying everything that words couldn't. In that moment, standing on the cobblestone driveway of one of Connecticut's most exclusive clubs, surrounded by the kind of wealth and privilege that had always seemed just out of reach, he made a choice that would echo through boardrooms and headlines for months to come. The merger documents could wait. The champagne could go flat. The lawyers could bill their hours to someone else's dreams. Some things, he realized, were worth more than all the money in the world. And his mother's dignity was at the very top of that list. The walk back up those marble steps felt like crossing a bridge between two different worlds. Bobby's Italian leather shoes clicked against the stone with the steady rhythm of a man who'd made his choice, even if the consequences hadn't fully crystallized yet. Behind him, his mother sat in the Navigator, her dignity intact, but her heart heavy with the knowledge that her presence had somehow disrupted the most important day of her son's business career. Ahead of him, through the tall Georgian windows, he could see the assembled crowd of lawyers, executives, and Whitmore family members still seated around the mahogany table, their champagne glasses catching the afternoon light like tiny beacons of a celebration that would never come. The dining room fell silent the moment Bobby stepped through the doorway. It wasn't the dramatic hush of a movie scene. It was something more unsettling, the kind of quiet that settles over a room when everyone senses that something fundamental has shifted, but no one quite understands what. Preston Ward, the Whitmore family's general counsel, looked up from his legal pad with the forced smile of a man trying to salvage a sinking ship. Bradley Whitmore fidgeted with his Rolex, while his older brother Clinton maintained the stone-faced expression that old money had taught him to wear in moments of uncertainty. Victoria Whitmore sat at the head of the table, her pearls resting against her silk blouse like armor, her wine glass poised halfway to her lips as if she'd frozen mid-sip. She wasn't just comfortable, she looked certain, absolutely convinced that this minor disruption would blow over like a summer thunderstorm. In her 70 years of privilege, she'd learned that money had a way of smoothing out even the roughest edges, that apologies could be purchased with the right combination of legal settlements and charitable donations. "Everything all right?" Preston asked, his voice carrying the particular brand of concern that lawyers deploy when they sense a multi-million-dollar problem brewing but can't yet identify its source. His pen hovered over the signature page of the merger agreement, ready to guide Bobby through the final formalities that would transform Mitchell Supply Chain Solutions from a family business into a subsidiary of one of America's most powerful conglomerates. Bobby didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the table, his eyes taking in every face, every expression, every subtle shift in body language that revealed how each person in the room viewed what had just transpired. Some looked genuinely confused, as if they'd missed an important piece of the puzzle. Others seemed mildly annoyed, checking their watches and calculating how much this delay might cost in billable hours and rescheduled flights. He stopped behind his chair, the leather seat where he'd planned to sign his name and secure his family's financial future for generations to come. The merger documents lay spread across the table like a roadmap to prosperity, every clause negotiated with surgical precision, every detail scrutinized by teams of lawyers who'd been paid handsomely to ensure that nothing could go wrong. The fountain pen, a Mont Blanc that had belonged to his father, sat beside the signature page like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. "I want to say something," Bobby announced, his voice cutting through the room's tension with the calm authority of a man who'd spent decades commanding respect in boardrooms from Newark to Manhattan. The conversations that had been murmuring around the edges of the gathering died instantly. Even the catering staff, who'd been quietly refilling water glasses and clearing appetizer plates, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and retreated to the kitchen. "You all know how much this deal meant," Bobby continued, his hands resting on the back of his chair with the steady grip of someone anchoring himself against a storm. "Not just for our companies but for the markets, for the next generation of supply chain infrastructure in this country. This merger would have changed everything, created thousands of jobs, revolutionized how goods move from coast to coast, established a new standard for logistics efficiency that our competitors would spend decades trying to match." He paused, letting his words settle over the room like dust after an explosion. Several people nodded, their expression suggesting they were relieved that Bobby seemed to be building toward the signing ceremony they'd all come to witness. Preston's pen moved closer to the documents, ready to facilitate the final steps of a process that had consumed the better part of 2 years. "But I'm not signing it," Bobby said, his voice never rising above conversational level but carrying the weight of an earthquake. The words hung in the Connecticut air like smoke from a house fire, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the air conditioning and the soft tick of an antique grandfather clock that had been counting time in this building since before Bobby was born. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the voices started. Low murmurs of confusion, someone saying, "Wait, what?" Under their breath, the rustle of papers as lawyers frantically searched for precedents or escape clauses that might explain what they'd just heard. Victoria's head turned sharply, not with the fluid grace of someone mildly surprised, but with the jerky motion of a person who'd just been slapped. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice carrying the particular brand of disbelief that comes from a lifetime of getting exactly what she wants, exactly when she wants it. The word "excuse" stretched out like taffy, each syllable dripping with the kind of condescension that money can't buy but privilege teaches from birth. Bobby nodded once, a gesture so slight it might have been missed by anyone not watching his face. "Excuse you, indeed," he replied, his tone matching hers for coolness, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Is this a negotiation tactic?" Preston tried, his lawyer's instincts kicking in as he searched for a rational explanation for what seemed like an irrational decision. "Derek, if there's a concern, we can go back to the table. We can adjust terms, revisit clauses, bring in additional mediators if necessary. These kinds of complex deals always have last-minute complications." Bobby finally sat down, but not in the signing chair. Instead, he chose the seat at the far end of the table, as far from the merger documents as the room's architecture would allow. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. He was physically distancing himself from the deal that had brought them all together, creating space between himself and the fortune that lay just a signature away. "No," he said simply. "There's no more table. There's no more negotiation. There's no more deal." The room erupted then, not with shouting or dramatic gestures, but with the kind of controlled chaos that happens when very wealthy people realize that very large amounts of money are about to disappear. Thomas Mitchell, Bobby's younger brother and business partner, leaned forward with the expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. Julian Ricks, the company's COO, started calculating the financial implications on his phone. The Whitmore family lawyers began whispering among themselves, their voices carrying the urgent undertones of people trying to prevent a disaster. Victoria scoffed, a sound that managed to convey both amusement and disdain in a single breath. She leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression that wealthy people wear when they're about to explain something to someone they consider intellectually inferior. "Let's not overreact to a simple misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult situations with difficult people. "I didn't recognize the woman, that's all. It happens at these events, so many faces, so many staff members coming and going. Surely we can move past this minor incident and focus on the business at hand." Bobby blinked once, slowly, like a man processing information that confirmed everything he'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. "That woman," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is my mother." "I'm aware of that now," Victoria replied, her tone suggesting that this new information was interesting, but ultimately irrelevant to the matter at hand. "But surely—" "No," Bobby cut her off, his voice still quiet but carrying the kind of finality that ends conversations rather than continuing them. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You said what you meant. You saw an elderly black woman in a church dress and you made an assumption. You made a judgment. You made a choice." Preston cleared his throat, his legal training kicking in as he tried to find solid ground in what was rapidly becoming quicksand. "We've invested millions in preparation for this merger," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent months coordinating due diligence, regulatory approvals, and shareholder communications. Both sides have legal obligations here. There are contracts, commitments, fiduciary responsibilities to consider. Bobby leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to something that might have been pity. "Then, I'll see you in court," he said with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "You can explain to a judge why disrespecting my family was part of your business strategy. You can tell 12 jurors why my mother's dignity was less important than your profit margins." "Don't be emotional," Victoria muttered, the words slipping out before she could stop them, carrying the particular brand of dismissiveness that people use when they want to invalidate someone's feelings without addressing the underlying issue. That did it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Bobby leaned forward, his hands folded on the table with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to control his temper through decades of navigating rooms where he was the only person who looked like him. "You think I built this company from a corner office?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of every 3 a.m. delivery run, every rejected loan application, every time he'd been told that people like him didn't belong in rooms like this. "I loaded trucks, Victoria. I drove routes at 3 in the morning, when other people were sleeping in beds they owned instead of apartments they rented. I ran payroll from a folding table when we couldn't afford an accountant, much less a corner office in Manhattan." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching as the comfortable assumptions that had shaped Victoria's worldview began to crack around the edges. "I watched my mother take the bus to clean houses so I could keep the lights on in our apartment. I watched her come home with aching knees and cleaning solution under her fingernails so I could have the chance to sit in rooms like this one. So when she shows up here wearing her finest dress, proud as hell of what her son has accomplished, and you humiliate her in front of strangers, you humiliate me." The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet, heavier, more complete, like the moment after lightning strikes but before the thunder arrives. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the grandfather clock seemed to have stopped ticking, as if time itself was holding its breath. "There are deals you lose sleep over not signing," Bobby said finally, standing up with the deliberate movements of someone who'd made peace with a difficult decision. "This isn't one of them." He walked toward the door, leaving behind the Mont Blanc pen that had belonged to his father, the merger documents that represented months of work, and the $1.2 billion that would have secured his family's financial future for generations. He didn't look back at the champagne glasses or the crystal chandelier or the oil paintings of long-dead Whitmore patriarchs who stared down from the walls with the same entitled expression that Victoria wore. At the doorway, he paused for just a moment, his hand on the brass handle that had been polished to mirror brightness by people who looked like his mother, people who'd learned to be invisible in spaces like this one. "Some things," he said without turning around, "are worth more than all the money in the world." Then he was gone, leaving behind a room full of very wealthy people who suddenly understood that they'd just witnessed something that couldn't be bought, sold, or negotiated away. The merger documents lay abandoned on the mahogany table like artifacts from a civilization that had just collapsed, and the only sound was the soft whisper of Victoria Whitmore's champagne glass as her trembling hand finally set it down. The morning after Bobby walked away from the Whitmore deal, his phone started ringing at 5:47 a.m. The first call came from Preston Ward, the Whitmore family's general counsel, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that expensive lawyers develop when billion-dollar deals evaporate overnight. The second call came from Julian Ricks, his own COO, who'd been fielding inquiries from investors since dawn. By 7 a.m., Bobby's assistant had counted 37 missed calls, and the parking lot outside Mitchell Supply Chain Solutions looked like a media circus, with the news vans lined up like dominoes along the industrial boulevard in Newark. Bobby sat in his corner office, watching the chaos unfold through windows that had once offered him a peaceful view of the Passaic River. Now, those same windows felt like a fishbowl, with telephoto lenses pointed at his building from across the street. He'd built this company from nothing, starting with a single rented truck and a folding table that served as his first desk. But he'd never imagined that walking away from a deal would generate this kind of attention. The merger documents still sat in his briefcase, unsigned and worthless, but somehow their absence felt heavier than their presence ever had. The first news story broke on a small business podcast out of Philadelphia, where a guest who'd attended the merger luncheon leaked just enough details to set the internet on fire. Black CEO walks out of $1.2 billion deal after mother insulted by white billionaire family, read the headline that would be copied, shared, and dissected across every major news platform in America. By noon, TechPulse, Forbes, and Business Today had picked up the story. By 5 o'clock, cable news anchors were debating it with the kind of breathless urgency usually reserved for natural disasters or political scandals. Bobby's first instinct was to stay quiet, to let the storm pass like he'd learned to do during his 40 years in business. But this wasn't just about him anymore. His phone buzzed with text messages from employees, some supportive, others worried about their jobs. Maria Santos, who'd worked in his warehouse for 12 years, sent a simple message. "Thank you for standing up." My grandmother would have been proud. But Tony Chen from the accounting department was more direct. "Are we going to be okay?" "My wife is pregnant, and we can't afford to lose our health insurance." The weight of those messages settled on Bobby's shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd made his decision in a moment of moral clarity, but now he had to live with the consequences, not just for himself, but for the 847 employees who depended on Mitchell Supply Chain Solutions for their livelihoods. The Whitmore merger would have secured their futures, provided better benefits, and opened doors to opportunities that a mid-sized logistics company could never offer on its own. Now all of that was gone, sacrificed on the altar of his mother's dignity and his own principles. Thomas Mitchell, Bobby's younger brother and business partner, arrived at the office around noon, his face carrying the weight of sleepless hours and difficult phone calls. At 70, Tommy had learned to read his older brother's moods like weather patterns, but this was uncharted territory. They'd built this company together, survived the recession of 2008, weathered the supply chain disruptions of the pandemic, and navigated countless challenges that would have sunk smaller operations. But they'd never faced anything like this. A crisis born not from market forces or economic downturns, but from a single moment of moral choice. "The phones haven't stopped ringing," Tommy said, settling into the leather chair across from Bobby's desk. "Half the calls are from reporters wanting statements. The other half are from investors wanting explanations. Monroe Bank called 3 times this morning. They're assessing our credit line." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "That's the credit line we were planning to use for the West Coast expansion." Bobby nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the mahogany surface that had once belonged to their father. The West Coast expansion had been their next big move, a chance to compete with the major players in California's booming logistics market. Without the Whitmore merger and without access to additional credit, that dream was effectively dead. But as he thought about his mother's face on those marble steps, about Victoria Whitmore's casual cruelty, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. "What about the employees?" Bobby asked. "What are they saying?" Tommy pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages and emails, mixed reactions. The warehouse crew seems mostly supportive. They remember when you used to load trucks alongside them at 3 in the morning. But some of the office staff are nervous. Janet and HR had 2 people ask about updating their resumes this morning. The irony wasn't lost on Bobby. The very employees he'd tried to protect by walking away from the deal were now questioning their job security because of his decision. It was a reminder that moral choices rarely come without costs, and those costs aren't always borne by the people who make the choices. By mid-afternoon, the story had taken on a life of its own. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like #dignity, over dollars, and respect matters, while business forums debated whether Bobby's decision was principled leadership or emotional overreaction. The responses split along predictable lines. Working-class Americans largely supported his choice, while Wall Street analysts questioned his business judgment. But the most powerful responses came from unexpected places. Leonard Greer, CEO of Stratus Line Logistics and a longtime competitor, went on the record with Business Today that same afternoon. Derek Mitchell left our partnership deal 5 years ago because he refused to approve wage cuts for our drivers, Greer told the reporter. I thought he was being stubborn at the time. Now, I wish I'd had his backbone. The statement carried extra weight because Greer was white, wealthy, and had no obvious reason to defend Bobby's decision beyond professional respect. More stories began to surface as the day wore on. A former employee of the Whitmore family posted on LinkedIn about being told to use the service elevator during a charity gala, even though she was attending as a guest. A Latina caterer shared how she'd once been asked to remove her apron before entering a front lobby for a setup, despite being hired to work the event. The thread got thousands of shares within hours, each story adding another layer to a narrative that was quickly becoming about more than just one canceled deal. But while public opinion seemed to be shifting in Bobby's favor, the business consequences were becoming increasingly clear. By Thursday morning, 3 potential partners had called to postpone meetings until the situation stabilizes. A major client in Atlanta sent a carefully worded email expressing concerns about ongoing disruptions to service. Most damaging of all, the Whitmore Group's legal team had begun drafting breach of contract claims, arguing that Bobby's withdrawal had cost them millions in preparation fees and lost opportunities. The pressure was taking its toll on Bobby's inner circle as well. During a tense executive meeting on Thursday afternoon, the fault lines within his own company became visible for the first time in years. Elliot Trammell, his CFO, was the first to voice what others were thinking. "We need to talk about what this means long-term," Elliot said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent sleepless nights running financial projections. "Not just this week, but 6 months out. We had international infrastructure tied to this merger, Bobby. Without it, we're looking at potential layoffs by Christmas." The words hung in the conference room air like smoke from a house fire. Bobby had built Mitchell Supply Chain Solutions on the principle that employees were family, not just line items on a balance sheet. The thought of laying off people who'd trusted him with their careers felt like a betrayal of everything he'd worked to create. Julian Ricks, his COO, leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd been wrestling with difficult truths. "We're barely a Series C company in terms of capital reserves. You think the board's not going to panic when they see the quarterly numbers? We're already getting calls from investors asking for emergency meetings." But it was Nia Whitlow, his head of marketing, who cut closest to the bone. "Bobby, I support your decision. I really do. But you've got to understand what you've become overnight. You're not just a CEO anymore. You're a symbol. People are calling you the man who walked away from generational wealth to protect his mother. That comes with expectations you never asked for." She was right, and Bobby knew it. The story had already been picked up by international news outlets. The BBC had run a segment about American business ethics. A German newspaper had used his decision as an example of principled capitalism. Somewhere along the way, his personal choice had become a public statement about values, integrity, and the price of dignity in corporate America. The weight of that symbolism became even heavier when the letters started arriving. Not emails or social media messages, but actual handwritten letters delivered through the postal service. The first one came from Camille Pierce, whose father had worked as the groundskeeper at the Whitmore estate for 24 years. Her letter, written in careful cursive on cream-colored stationery, told the story of a man who'd maintained his dignity while remaining invisible to the family he'd served. "You reminded me of my father," she wrote. "He never had your platform, but he had your spine. I just wanted you to know that not everyone forgets where they came from or who they stand up for." More letters followed throughout the week. A retired postal worker from Detroit wrote about being overlooked for promotions despite perfect performance reviews. A former factory supervisor from Ohio described similar treatment at company events where his presence was tolerated but never welcomed. Each letter carried the same underlying message. Someone had finally said no, and it mattered. But perhaps the most unexpected response came from within the business community itself. 3 mid-sized logistics firms reached out quietly, expressing interest in partnerships that had nothing to do with the failed Whitmore deal. They weren't offering the same scale of opportunity, but they represented something potentially more valuable. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial necessity. People want to work with companies that stand for something, explained David Kim, CEO of Pacific Coast Logistics, during a phone call on Friday afternoon. Your decision sent a message about your values that's worth more than a merger to some of us. The conversation with Kim sparked an idea that had been percolating in Bobby's mind since the moment he'd walked out of the Riverside Country Club. If the Whitmore deal had been about scaling up through acquisition, perhaps there was another way to grow, through partnerships based on shared principles rather than financial dominance. That weekend, Bobby drove to Trenton to have dinner with his mother, as he did every Sunday. Maggie was in her kitchen, stirring a pot of collard greens that filled the small house with the smell of his childhood. She moved slowly but purposefully, her dignity intact despite the media attention that had made her an unwitting public figure. "How are you holding up with all this craziness?" Bobby asked, settling into the same chair he'd occupied during countless family dinners over the decades. Maggie smiled, the expression carrying the wisdom of someone who'd weathered far worse storms than media scrutiny. "Baby, I've been dealing with people underestimating me for 89 years. A few reporters and photographers don't scare me." She paused, ladling greens onto his plate with the same care she'd shown when he was a boy coming home from school. "But I worry about you, about your business, about all those people depending on you." Bobby took a bite of the greens, tasting the familiar blend of ham hock and patience that had sustained him through every challenge of his adult life. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." "I know you will," Maggie replied. "But don't carry this burden alone. You made the right choice, but that doesn't mean it was the easy choice, and easy choices don't usually change anything." Her words stayed with him as he drove back to Jersey City that evening. The city lights reflected off the Hudson River, creating patterns that reminded him of the first time he'd seen Manhattan from this angle. A young man with big dreams in a borrowed truck, wondering if he had what it took to build something lasting. Now, 40 years later, he was still asking himself the same question, but the stakes had changed. It wasn't just about his own success anymore. It was about proving that integrity could coexist with profitability, that doing the right thing didn't have to mean financial suicide. The answer would come sooner than he expected, but not in the way he'd imagined. By Monday morning, the ripple effects of his decision would extend far beyond the business world, touching lives and inspiring choices that would echo through boardrooms and family dinner tables across America. The story of a CEO who chose his mother's dignity over a billion-dollar deal was becoming something larger, a reminder that some things truly are worth more than money, and that sometimes the most powerful business decision is the one that puts humanity first. As Bobby prepared for another week of uncertainty, phone calls, and difficult conversations, he carried with him the knowledge that he'd already won the only victory that truly mattered. He could still look his mother in the eye, still sleep soundly at night, and still face himself in the mirror each morning. In a world where success is often measured in dollars and market share, those simple truths felt like the most valuable currency of all. 5 years after Bobby Mitchell walked away from the Whitmore deal, The ripple effects of his decision had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who found courage in his example. The Gloria Initiative had grown from a simple foundation into a nationwide movement, providing healthcare screenings, educational scholarships, and dignity training programs for working families across America. What started as one man's refusal to compromise his values had become a blueprint for principled leadership in corporate America. The reconciliation with his uncle Dwayne proved to be one of the most healing chapters of Bobby's later years. Their monthly fishing trips to the Delaware River became sacred time. Two men in their 70s casting lines and sharing stories they'd kept buried for decades. Dwayne's return wasn't just about family healing. It represented the power of second chances and the courage required to admit our failures. As Bobby often told his grandchildren, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is pick up the phone and say you were wrong. The business world had taken notice, too. Mitchell Supply Chain Solutions, once considered a mid-tier player, had become the gold standard for ethical business practices. 3 major logistics firms had approached Bobby for partnerships, drawn not by his financial success, but by his reputation for treating workers with dignity. The company's Respect First policy had been adopted by dozens of corporations, proving that profitability and principles could coexist. But perhaps the most profound change was in Bobby himself. At 77, he'd learned that true wealth isn't measured in bank statements, but in the ability to sleep peacefully at night. His mother, now 94 and still sharp as a tack, lived in a beautiful assisted living facility where the staff knew her story and treated her like royalty. Every Sunday, Bobby would bring her gardenias and banana pudding, and they'd sit together watching the sunset through her window. "You know what I'm proudest of?" Maggie asked him one evening, her weathered hand resting on his. "Not the money you made or the deals you signed. I'm proud that when the world tried to make you choose between success and your soul, you chose your soul." Bobby squeezed her hand gently. "You taught me that some things are worth more than money, Mama. Dignity, respect, family. Those are the only currencies that matter in the end." The lesson had become his legacy. In a world that often demands we compromise our values for advancement, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply say no and mean it. What would you have done in Bobby's shoes? Would you have walked away from $1.2 billion to defend your mother's dignity? Or would the financial security have been too tempting to refuse? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between money and your principles? Your stories matter and could inspire someone else who's facing a similar crossroads. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that some things are truly priceless, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe for more stories about courage, integrity, and the power of standing up for what's right.